Hey, what's up, friends? Well, thank you for tuning into today's debate. My name is Jed, the Flying Spaghetti Auditor. Today, I'm joined by Alex. How are you doing today, Alex?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Excellent. So, my understanding is that you are an agnostic and you're kind of on the fence. You wouldn't bet money either way as to whether God exists or doesn't exist. Is that right?
Yes, but as time goes on, I'm just sort of seem to be drifting from atheism, which I was raised an atheist for 20 years, and then over the past few months, it's just like slowly more and more leaning towards like Christianity, basically.
You know, it's interesting. It almost seems like you and I have opposite stories because I was raised in a Christian home and I was a Christian for 20 years. And then I became an atheist in college. So, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I thought that our stories did seem pretty opposite when I saw. I haven't seen a lot of your content, but I've seen like maybe a dozen or two like YouTube shorts that you've made. Um, I did want to ask you what sort of undid it for you.
Yeah, the biggest thing for me was the recognition that I never had any good evidence in the first place. So, I don't
Mm,
know if you've seen, I've shared my testimony a few times, but it's pretty short. Basically, I was just talking with a group of friends. They asked me if I believed in God. I said, yeah, I do. And then they asked, why? Why do you believe in God? And I didn't have a good reason. So I went out searching, looking. I watched tons of debates, tons of informational videos. I started reading the Bible with a more critical eye. And then eventually I realized I never had any good reason to believe any of this stuff is true in the first place. And evidently, no one does either. And in addition to that, there's also a lot of moral atrocities that Christianity promotes, just moral abominations all the way through, which I just couldn't get behind once I started looking at them in a more critical way.
Fair enough. We can. I think you mentioned to me you wanted to talk about the existence of God, and then you also said you
Yeah,
wanted to talk about some moral stuff.
sure. Yeah,
It might
definitely.
it might
Yeah,
be
if we
we
could
can do that
dive
in whatever
into
order
evidence
you'd
for
like.
God, just lay out the what you think is the most compelling argument or evidence for the Christian God.
That's a good question. Um, Maybe I'll come back another day and we can talk about the historical side of it. I don't think I'm like prepared to defend that right now. The claim I would make is just that theism, specifically theism via divine revelation, is probably the only consistent worldview that could exist. So that's
When you
my
say
thesis.
theism, specifically Christianity, is the only coherent worldview that can exist.
Yeah.
Okay, what makes atheism incoherent?
Sorry. It's a good question. So an atheist, well, I'll just ask you, right? Do you believe that the laws of logic are true?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, like
Okay.
by laws of logic, you're talking about like the law of identity, non-contradiction, and
Exactly.
excluded middle.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I believe they're true. The
Okay.
laws of logic, from my understanding, are presuppositional axioms that everyone has to presuppose in order to use logic in the first place, because you have to presuppose them in order to demonstrate that they're true.
Yes, but you don't need to presuppose them, right?
If you don't presuppose the laws of logic, then you can't utilize logic, which means that you
I
can't.
agree.
Yeah, you can't. So my understanding is that you and I are both presupposing the laws of logic. So what's
Well, not
different?
not necessarily,
Okay,
right?
so
Like
you
if I
don't
if
need to
I were to
presuppose them.
say if I said I presuppose God and the laws of logic are derived from God, I don't see how we're on equal footing.
Yeah, to me that seems completely irrational. So when you say they're derived from God, that doesn't really explain anything, and it's not really a justification for how you can know the laws of logic are true in the first place. So all you're really doing is presupposing the three axioms of logic the same as I am, and then you're adding another presupposition on top of that, which is God. But how does the existence of God get you to logic?
Um, no, it's the other way around. The argument would be that God is a necessary precondition for logic, logic, therefore God.
Yeah, I've heard the presup argument a number of times, and to me it just doesn't make any sense. What is it about, like, if you presuppose God, how does that get you to logic exists or logic is true?
I'm pretty sure it's sort of the other way around. So it would be, without God, there's no justification for logic. So if you want logic, you have to have God.
How
Like to
does
say that.
God
Sorry,
how
you
does
go.
God justify logic?
Um, God would essentially serve as a kind of, I'm sure you've heard of like the prime mover argument. It's almost like the prime justification. Like, so if all beliefs require justification, then you need some like thought terminating, self-justifying belief.
The connection between God and logic to me seems like a complete non sequitur. I mean, couldn't I just say I presuppose the flying spaghetti monster and use him as a prerequisite to get to logic, or a necessary condition for logic?
Well, sure, but that would still be a theistic claim, right? So,
Sure.
wow.
But yeah,
So
and even in that
atheism's
sense,
done.
and even in that example, I don't see how the flying spaghetti monster gets you to logic either. It seems like you're just making up a god and saying it's a justification for logic, but there's no connection between the two.
I'm not saying that. Um, let me think about how to phrase this. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the case that if God exists, then logic. It's the other way around. I'm saying if logic exists, the logic would require, like, if your claim is that my belief needs justification, then my claim would turn it back on you and say, why doesn't your belief need why doesn't your belief in the laws of logic require any external justification?
Well, I would say that using God as a justification for logic is meaningless. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't deepen our understanding. It's just inserting a God somewhere, because nobody has a justification for the laws of logic, because like we've said, we have to assume them in order to prove that they're true. So yeah, there's just no connection between God and logic. And I think it's also worth pointing out, and I don't know if you're a Trinitarian, but notions of many notions of the Christian God, the Trinity God, completely violates the laws of logic. So how can a God that violates logic be a necessary precondition for logic?
I would disagree that many notions of the Christian God violate the laws of logic, but even if I was to make like a minimal case, there are non-Trinitarian Christians,
Sure.
supposedly. So it's like it's
Are
not like
you
a
a
strict refutation.
are
I
you a
would probably
Trinitarian?
be a Trinitarian, but um the the I don't here's let me make like a minimal
Well, if
case
I
for
can
you.
if I can explain how the Trinity violates logic. So
Yeah, sure.
Jesus is God, right?
Ye- yes.
And the Father is also God. But
Yes.
Jesus is not the Father. So if A equals
Yes.
B and A equals B and C equals B, A has to equal C. So if Jesus is God,
Um
the Father is God, then Jesus has to be the Father. They're the same person. But then in Trinitarianism, they're different.
well, I don't sure. This is complicated, right? Because you could say like um one like
If
I
Jesus
don't know how
is
to
fully
explain this.
God, if Jesus is fully God and the Father
Yeah.
is fully God,
Yeah.
then they're co-equal to each other. They have to be completely equal.
They are co-equal, but they aren't like ontologically the same.
Yeah, then that violates the law of identity, because if Jesus is God, his identity is God, and then the Father's identity is God, then Jesus and the Father have the same identity. But if Jesus and Father have different characteristics, then they're no longer the same person.
But no one says they're the same person. That's the point. It's three persons.
Right. So that means you're a polytheist, where you believe in three different gods.
Well, no, because they would share the same divine nature. So there's one divine nature shared between all three persons.
Is God, I mean, is God one agent, or is God just a category that three different agents fall under?
That's a good question. Uh, I I don't know if this is a useful line of inquiry because given that I haven't like looked into this much, like I've never heard a debate about this particular topic. So even if I said, "Yep, I have no idea, don't understand it at all," like you wouldn't change my mind because I haven't heard the arguments from the other side.
That's fair. And yeah, I think all notions of the Trinity are just completely incoherent because they rely on this idea that Jesus and the Father are the same, but not the same at the same time, which is just a complete violation of logic. But I bring it up only to illustrate the fact that an entity like God can't serve as a precondition for logic if his identity contradicts everything we know about logic. But even if we ignore all that, I still don't see any connection between God and logic. What is it about God that allows us to have knowledge or have logic in the first place?
Um, the let me make like so there's an argument that I'm trying to make called the transcendental argument for God. I'm sure you've heard of it
Uh-huh.
before.
Unfortunately.
There's like a weak version of this called Plantinga's Reformed Epistemology, which is just the claim that all systems have axioms that cannot be proven, right? Like I think it's called Plantinga's trilemma, or there's some trilemma about this, which is that like if you have a belief, then you either have circular justification or no justification or an infinite regress of justification. And none of these are like good, right? So no set of beliefs can be, in theory, no set of beliefs are totally absent or can be proven to be necessarily better than another at the axiomatic level.
And God would fall under the infinite category because he's an infinite God. So anytime you use God as a justification, you're appealing to the infinity, right?
No, God would be more of a circular justification. Like the God would be like there's a bedrock of justification that justifies itself.
Yeah, my issue with presup arguments and the tag argument is that it's just presupposing the existence of God and then basically using word games and semantics to argue that he has to exist for some unknown reason. Let me
Right,
ask you
but
this.
okay.
Could
Okay, yeah,
okay,
you go on.
I was
Sorry.
going to ask, can lot if there was no God, would we still have logic?
It depends on what you mean by like would we still have justification for logic? I would say no.
Why not?
Where would it come from?
When you say justification for logic, what does justification mean?
It's a good question. I would say justification is an external referent that creates the conditions for the thing that we're discussing.
Well, the word creates kind of smuggles in the idea that there's an agent behind it, and I would reject that.
I don't think so. Like when I say creates, I just mean you've got a thing, and then that thing leads to something else.
Sure. Yeah, and my position is that the axioms of logic are they're my presuppositions. But I
Sure,
don't think presupposing a God and saying it's a justification for logic actually gets you out of the hole of presupposing the axioms of logic because you're still presupposing them. You're just also presupposing God and then claiming he's a justification without demonstrating any connection between the two.
the first point I'm making, which is like a very weak case, is just that if presuppositions are allowed to be taken, then there's no argument you could make almost as a matter of definition against my presupposition.
Well, my argument to that would be we should have as few presuppositions as possible because presupposing things, the more things that we presuppose, the higher likelihood that we could be wrong, right? Because we should have a justification for as many of our beliefs as possible. So if you
Right, but
presuppose the four
You-
axioms of logic and a God, and I just presuppose, the three axioms of logic and not a
Yep.
God, then I'm less likely to be wrong than you are because I'm assuming one less thing.
Sorry. The idea that you can have rules around presuppositions violates the nature of a presupposition in and of itself.
Why?
Well, okay, here's a question. Do you agree that it's possible for someone to reject all presuppositions and then flop around like a fish and just not believe anything at all?
I mean, people could do all sorts of things, but that
Well,
doesn't seem
would
like
they
a good way to
be?
live your life. It seems like
Yeah, I
for
agree.
most of us to function without even realizing it, we're presupposing the axioms of logic.
I agree. But my point is that you can't you couldn't say that they would be more wrong, right, absent logic than you are with logic, because your belief in logic is absent any justification.
I don't know as if I would say my belief in logic is absent any justification. It's just ultimately I have to presuppose the laws of logic. But once I do that, I can use the laws of logic to demonstrate that the laws of logic are consistent with our observations in reality. And yes, that's ultimately circular because I have to
Yep.
presuppose them in order to prove that they're true. But what demonstration can we do to prove that God is true? If we presuppose that there's a God, now what testing can we do to
Shit. Okay, hold on. Can you hear me? I can see you, but I can't hear you. You cut out for a second.
Hey, Alex, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Good. Oh, excellent. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it looks like my computer went from 100% to 1%. So
Oof.
yeah, hopefully that's not hopefully that's the last time it happens
Let's hope so.
tonight or for you this morning. But yeah,
It's almost afternoon now.
yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
So
we were talking about logic, and I'm curious, maybe if we presuppose God, are there any tests we can do to show that God is real? Is there anything I can do to go out
well,
and look or find a God?
but it's a good question. But then the claim would be like, well, if you're presupposing God, then everything you're doing is like proof of God. Like if your presupposition is that God creates everything, then in the same way that like if your presupposition is the laws of logic, and then you go and do some maths, and then you're like, oh my God, the laws of logic work. Well, that's not very surprising, right? Like if your presupposition is that God is the justification for everything, then there's nothing you could do that wouldn't flow downstream from that.
What if I presuppose that no gods exist, and that's my justification for logic? To me, that
I
seems
don't
just as
see how
incoherent as
you.
the opposite.
No, but the claim would be that inherent in God's nature is rationality, right? That would be like a part of the definition. So
But how
that's
do
how
we
you would
know
get the
that?
one from the other.
We're just making that up and using that as a
Yeah, sure,
justification.
but the man who's flopping around like a fish would tell you that, how do you know the laws of logic exist? You're just making that up.
Well, I can say I'm a person, I'm Jed, and you are a different person, you're Alex. And even though we're both people, we're still completely different individuals, right? So that's a demonstration of the law of identity. But how can we showcase God?
Well, that's a demonstration of the law of identity if you think the law of identity. Like the claim I'm Jed itself is you're assuming the law of identity in the claim.
Yeah, because it's an axiom that I have to presuppose in order to prove that it's true. Yeah, you're right.
Right. So my only point here is that at the presuppositional level, I can't see what basis you would have for saying that my presupposition is wrong, or that it's not as justified as yours. But even the idea of justifying a presupposition is kind of contrary to the very nature, right?
Well, I would say that my presuppositions are the minimum necessary presuppositions that everyone needs to have. And you're adding
But
one
the
in
guy
addition to
flopping around
those.
like a fish is telling you you actually don't need them.
Well, I don't see anyone flopping around like a fish. Most of us are utilizing the law or acknowledging the laws of logic without even realizing it. So most of us are utilizing them, I should say, without even realizing it. But if we could presuppose anything, and how do we know whether our presuppositions match reality or not? I mean, that's the point. So if I presuppose that there is a teapot orbiting Jupiter, how do I demonstrate that that's real? There needs to be some sort of demonstration other than the presupposition.
That's a fair argument, but you understand that presuppositions. I mean, we could agree, for example, that if you presuppose the laws of logic, and let's say you presuppose that sort of sense data is like relatively reliable, we could say it's truth apt, even if it's not always perfect. Then you can go, and you're presupposing that there's a teapot orbiting Jupiter. Well, it would be pretty hard to check every spot orbiting Jupiter, but if you could, you might not find one, and then you could say that your presuppositions are in contradiction. So that would be a problem because you've presupposed the law of non-contradiction as well. But like, for example, if somebody presupposed that sense data was always not reliable, and then they said that there's a teapot orbiting Jupiter, there's nothing you could do that would demonstrate to them that that's not true.
Well, there's nothing that anyone can do to demonstrate that's not true, whether or not you accept your sense data, because we can't possibly search all the space that is orbiting Jupiter. I mean, that's the whole point of the teapot. Our ability to investigate is so limited that we can't possibly look at all the space. So no matter how much empty space we find, there could still be a teapot out there. So it's unfalsifiable.
It's a demonstrative example. Like we could pick anything. We could pick, whether or not there's an empty can of Monster Energy on my desk, which there does happen to be. But if I couldn't see it, and then I just said, well, I'll just assume it's there, absent any sense data. And then if I don't trust sense data and I still don't see it, I could just say, well, it's got to be there.
Do you trust your sense data?
Good question. I believe that sense data is truth apt, but whether that belief has justification or not is a different question.
I mean, our senses are the only tools that we have to investigate the world around us. So we have to rely on our sense data. And, I fully acknowledge that sense data often is unreliable. People hear things all the time. People think they see things and they're wrong. But one of the best things that we can do to enhance our sense data is compare it to other people through independent confirmation.
Right. So now you've taken the additional presupposition that other conscious minds exist.
Right. But if there were no other conscious minds, that means that I would live in a hard solipsist universe. If I was the only mind that exists, and the whole reality around me is completely fictitious. Now, that's another presupposition I have. And to my knowledge, I only have 4 presuppositions, which are the 3 axioms of logic and the rejection of hard solipsism, or the acceptance that the world around me is real. Because I have no choice but to accept that it's real and try my best to survive, because for all intents and purposes, pain and death seem to be completely real. So if I avoid them, then seemingly I'm prolonging my life, or at least prolonging the life that appears to be real that I'm currently living in. So I have no evidence that there's any life outside of this. I have no evidence that other conscious minds are actually fake, a figment of my imagination, or I'm in a simulation, but I can't disprove any of those things. But just because I can't disprove them doesn't mean I have good justification to believe that they're true.
No, well, first of all, you definitely take more than 4 presuppositions. So, like, at least the 5th one would be the axiom of induction, right? That the universe is relatively uniform across time and that we can make future predictions based on past events. But
okay, that sounds reasonable.
Sure, you seem to be taking a 6th one, which is that having fewer presuppositions is better than having more, which isn't, like, you can't demonstrate that.
Well,
logically.
Sure we can. If we presuppose, the more things we presuppose, the more likely we are to be wrong, because we're just adding more and more variables.
Okay, but then the logical conclusion of that presupposition is that you should have none.
Not necessarily. Some of them are necessary.
Some of them are necessary for what you want to do, right? Like, you would like for your sense data to be interpretable, so you presuppose all of these things, which is fine, but it's not clear to me that that gives you any justification to say that anyone else's presuppositions aren't correct. Like, if I want logic itself to be grounded in something, like, how is your desire for interpretable sense data better than my desire for transcendental justification?
Well, I don't have a choice but to assume that sense data is mostly reliable and that the universe I
Flop
live in
around
is
like a fish.
real. Well, that's not a good way to live my life, nor would I. It's not a productive way to live my life. Nobody lives their life like that.
But what do
wants
you
to
even
flop around like a
What do
fish.
you even mean by? Well, hold on. Okay, so nobody wants to flop around like a fish. Well, if I don't want to take the laws of logic axiomatically, if I want them to be justified by something external, why is your explanation for your presuppositions justified, but mine isn't?
It seems like what this whole argument is, the whole tag argument is, hey, look at these things that you have to presuppose as a matter of necessity to even function in the universe. Therefore, I'm justified in making up whatever presuppositions I want to, and we're on equal footing. So you can't prove that you're not a brain in a vat. Therefore, my God is real. That's what it seems like the argument's saying.
No. So first of all, I'm not really making the tag argument per se. I think I don't know much about it. I think this is closer to Reformed epistemology, which is just the claim that all presuppositions are equally valid absent a contradiction in them. The tag argument would be me telling you that your presupposition is actually wrong, right? That to take logic axiomatically as opposed to deriving it from somewhere external, that would be the tag argument. But I'm just making like the minimal case that it seems like there's nothing you can tell me that would make my presupposition incorrect.
You said that it's okay to assume presuppositions as long as there's no inherent contradiction. Did I hear that right?
As long as you're assuming non-contradiction, then yeah.
But there's tons of things I could assume that aren't contradictory. Like, what if I assume that there's a flying spaghetti monster? That doesn't contradict anything we see in reality, but do I have a good reason to believe that just because it's not contradictory?
I'm making the case that it would be under the view that you seem to have set out in the justification that you've given for your presuppositions. Maybe we'll use the words axioms because it's a bit shorter. In your axioms, when you've explained to me why you've taken them, it would be under your view equally logical to take the flying spaghetti monster axiomatically.
Well, I don't think so because it's not a necessary axiom. Nothing's demanding that I take it as an axiom. But these other things, the uniformity of nature, the fact that my sense data is reliable, the laws of logic, I have no choice but to assume these things, and neither does anyone else. You're assuming all the same things that I am, and you're adding another one, which I don't think has any good justification. And there's no evidence for it in reality. It's entirely just making up a God out of nothing. It's wishful thinking. It's I wish there was a God, therefore I'm going to make one up and claim that he justifies these axioms that everyone assumes, but I'm claiming that I have a justification for these axioms because I'm assuming that this God exists. But there's no good reason to believe that this God exists.
But you're making the same argument when you say, well, I just assume sense data is truth apt because otherwise that would really suck, right?
It's not necessarily that it would really suck. It's that for all, like, I have evidence that my sense data is real. Like, I
You
can touch things
absolutely
and I
do
feel
not.
them.
Yeah, you have evidence that you have sense data. I don't deny
Sure.
that. But like there could be, right, a shotgun aimed like right between your eyes right now, and you just can't see it because you have no proof, absent sense data, that sense data is reliable.
Well, I can have extremely high confidence that there's no shotgun right between my eyes because for one, I can go like this and I didn't touch any shotguns.
Yeah, it's behind. It's
There's a
actually behind your
computer right
head.
in front of me that would be blocking anyone that's holding a shotgun. I'm in a
It's a
room by
magical
myself. My
shotgun.
doors are locked. I don't hear any footsteps. I've got a dog that barks at everything. So the fact that he's quiet right now means that
Well,
there's
hold on,
probably
but
not
you hold
an
on.
invisible home intruder.
You've just made a ton of appeals to sense data, right? You say
Sure.
you haven't
Yeah.
heard your dog, you don't see it, you don't feel it. None of these are like absent the presup that sense data is reliable. None of these are reliable.
Right. So basically, I'm assuming that I'm not a brain in a vat and that the world around me is real and that my sense data is my only tool to access what the world around me is like.
Yeah, and you do that because otherwise it would really suck, right?
I do it because I have no other choice. If I want to be a functioning member of society and live a fulfilling life,
How
I
do you
have
even
no
know that
choice but
society
to assume that
exists?
these things are real. I want to avoid dying. I want to stay alive.
Okay, but how do you like you said if you want to be a functioning member of it seems like you're just making almost an appeal to emotion at this point. Like
I'm making
it would
an
make you
appeal to
happier.
necessity. I have no reason to believe that my sense data is not reliable, and I have every reason
Okay.
to believe that it is reliable. I think
So
the
if I said
claim
I
that
have
I'm a
no
brain in a
reason
vat
to
and that the universe isn't real, I think that's a claim that demands justification.
um but you're deriving all of this from your axioms. Absent your axioms, you could not say either way. And the arguments you've given me so far are things like, well, I need it to to lead a meaningful and fulfilling life, right? You understand that this is a very common argument that
Sure,
religious
and
people would make.
yeah, and I understand that, and it may not be the best argument. Ultimately, I am assuming these things, and whether I have good justification or not, it's an axiom that I have to assume as a matter of necessity. But I don't think the fact that we both have axioms means that you're justified in making up another one. What's like you're assuming all the same things I am, and you're just adding another axiom on top of that, which is the existence of God. But what's the necessity for the existence of God?
Well, the argument would be that it's I'm not like assuming the laws of logic and assuming all these other things. I'm assuming God, and in the God that I'm assuming, he has like a rational nature. He has, so that's where you would get like the laws of logic. He would have like a good nature. You might disagree, but that's where we would get like morality from, stuff like that.
It seems like you're just defining a God into existence. You're just saying words and therefore God exists. Like, oh, and it's we're both assuming all the same things about the laws of logic and sensory data being reliable, but then you're saying I assume God and then all these other things I derive from God. But to me that's meaningless because there's no connection, there's no demonstration that God leads to these other sensations or ideas.
Well, okay. Would you agree that if God exists, if a rational God exists, then we would expect to have like a rational universe? or not?
If a rational God exists, would we have a rational universe?
I'm not asking you to agree that God is like a necessary precondition for a rational universe, but just that if God does exist and he's rational, then we would expect to see, or you could even make the other way around. If God,
Well, I don't even know what an irrational universe would look like. A universe that doesn't have laws of logic, to me, is so incoherent that it can't exist. I mean, that's the whole point of logic, is that it's a logical contradiction, meaning it can't happen.
well,
So
it
I
can't
don't think
happen as long as the laws of logic exist.
a universe could exist without the laws of logic. So whether God is rational or not, I don't think any God would be capable of creating an illogical universe, or a universe that violates logic in any way. I don't think
You can't.
logic is able to be contradicted. And I think even if there is a God, logic would be, he would have to presuppose logic. He wouldn't be bound by the laws of logic just like everyone else.
Okay. Um, but you couldn't demonstrate any of these absent logic. So I'm totally fine with saying that my argument is essentially circular. I just think that you need to, like, I don't see why your argument being circular is any better than mine.
I think the main reason, and I hope I don't sound like a broken record, is that we're both assuming the same things, and you're adding an extra assumption that I'm not. And that assumption demands a demonstration. Because there could be a universe. I think I don't see any logical contradiction that there could be a universe in which no gods exist. How is that contradictory?
It's a good question. You could, I don't know. I wasn't like prepared to make this argument. You could make an argument like the
Well, we
prime
could
mover
move on from the
argument.
tag argument. In fact, I'd love that, because it's one of my least favorite. It's very uninteresting to me.
Again, I'm not making the tag argument per se. The tag argument would be that your axioms are totally unjustified. I'm not necessarily making that argument. I'm just saying that to whatever extent your axioms are justified, when I've asked you about them, you're saying, well, I need them because otherwise I can't make sense of anything, or I need them because I need them to lead a fulfilling life. Well, I don't see why my axioms aren't equally justified.
Yeah, and the living a fulfilling life bit, and I probably shouldn't have said that. It's not a good reason to.
I think it's a very good reason.
Well, I don't think you could make up a God and say, I live a fulfilling life because of my belief in God, and that wouldn't be good evidence that something is real. So I think when it comes to something like the laws of logic, I don't think I have a choice. I have to presuppose them. So I don't even necessarily think I need a justification to presuppose the laws of logic, because I can't do anything else. I have to presuppose them, and so does everyone.
Yeah, maybe, but I think the case being made by the Christians on this side would be something like, you have to presuppose them, but unless they have justification, it has no meaning to presuppose them, because, like you said, you could presuppose anything. And so
Right.
the fact that you presuppose them means that you should also be presupposing the justifier, and the justifier in the Christian view would be God.
Did this argument, were you a theist before you heard this argument? Or, I mean, I know you said you were an atheist and then you're leaning towards theism, but is this the argument that really pushed you towards the edge?
This argument, I think, makes a case that theism is not irrational, even if you're taking it presuppositionally. This is an argument that opened my mind to the idea that you are just as justified. Like when people say, like, oh, you have to take it on faith, and then atheists are like, no, like everything has to be, there's like the evidentialists who would say everything requires evidence, but the claim that everything requires evidence itself is absent evidence. So you can't say that, right?
I guess to me, like these meta arguments, they just sound like semantic word games. It sounds like, and I know, and I'm not saying this is intentional on your part, but apologists who use these kinds of arguments, it seems like they're trying to trick people into agreeing that there's a God, or agreeing that they're justified in believing in a God, because there's no actual evidence. So instead of presenting real tangible evidence for a God that we can look at, because for any other thing that really exists, we tend to be able to touch it, feel it. We have some sort of observation that leads us to believe in these claims. But for the God claim, the only thing that we can do is play word games and try to trick people into agreeing that there's a God by getting them to acknowledge that they have some beliefs that they don't ultimately have a justification for because they rely on axioms.
Yeah. The problem is that I've heard this word game argument a lot, but I haven't actually heard a real counter argument, which concerns me greatly. In my
I don't
experience, whenever somebody's actually just playing word games, you can usually like construct, a reasonable counter and demonstrate it. But I think the problem that people have. So this is, I think it was Van Til, who's like one of these like one of the really first guys who thought about this kind of presuppositional apologetics. He said there's no such thing as neutral ground, right? Because if the theist believes that the laws of logic are contingent upon God, and then you're saying, well, we can just agree on the laws of logic, but we can't, because from my view, your view is unjustified. So there's no neutral
from
ground
my view,
here.
your view is unjustified. I mean, because you're just assuming that God exists without any real justification.
But from your own view, your view is unjustified, right? We've already established that there's no justification for like the laws of logic absent some vague notion of necessity, or some, the world would be uninterpretable absent the laws of logic. But that's not a strong argument.
Yeah, I think that once we assume the laws of logic, we can then use the laws of logic to demonstrate that they're reliable. But if we do the same thing with God, if we assume there's a God, could we then utilize our assumption that there's a God to prove a God?
Okay, this is what it sounds like to me. I'm going to give you an analogy, right? It's like as if someone said, if we assume calculus is true, right? Like we can prove calculus, but we don't need algebra to prove calculus, because we can just prove the calculus, absent algebra within its own framework. But like, to me, I've got an ultimate grounding, and then from there's like some level 1 derivation. And you're saying, why don't we just assume the level 1 derivation? Well, that's not how it works.
Why not?
Or at least if it is how it works, you can say that, but you can't, like, if what I would derive is your presupposition, I don't see how my presupposition is wrong.
Maybe we can get away from the logic, and this might be a good segue question. Does the God that you think exists manifest in reality in any way? Or does he have any interaction with reality on a regular basis?
It would seem that way. In fact, so this is another argument people make. I'm not like, if you want to move on to the moral stuff, we can, by the way, because I feel like we're kind of reaching the limits of
Sure.
what I
Well,
can
and that's why I
argue.
kind of wanted to switch gears into how God interacts with the world, because
Yeah, sure.
if, at best, the logical arguments get you to a deistic God, but then if we believe in a personal God that interacts with the world, the interaction that he has with the universe is observable. It has to be. So if God interacts with reality, what's the interaction?
So that's a good question. The presuppositionalists would say, for example, on this topic, that believing in a deistic God is kind of a fool's errand, because you're saying that you believe in a God that you can't actually know anything about. So this is like a presuppositional argument for divine revelation, that like, if a God exists, it has to be one that's been revealed. Otherwise, again, you're just like absent any foundation. I don't know if I'm properly prepared to make like a historical case for God,
have any gods ever interacted with you?
Good question. Not that I'm aware of.
Me neither.
Yeah.
I think that well, anyway, since you said no, we can move on from there.
Hey,
Do you think? Are
one
you
time I
convinced
prayed
that?
to God, and then I got a job, and then I got a job offer. So I think it's pretty clear, pretty convincing stuff, you know.
Yeah, there you go. Well, one time I prayed to God that I could get a hard on, and then what do you know? So
Whoa. Yeah, clearly
that,
this is a
that's actually
strong
a
argument.
bit. That's a bit from Christopher Hitchens, I believe. Someone asked him like, "Have you ever actually prayed for God when you at any time?" He's like, "What? Once for a hard on, But
Listen,
rest in peace to Mr. Hitchens.
if somebody had erectile dysfunction and they prayed to God and they got a hard on, I'd say, hey, maybe it's
A
true.
miracle. Hey, and if we can reliably demonstrate that prayers instantly cure erectile dysfunction, then that might actually be great evidence for a God. Maybe not the Christian God, because the Christian God doesn't like promiscuity, but perhaps some
That's
other
true.
God that enjoys lustful actions, the gods of
Yeah,
the
Aphrodite
pagan
maybe.
Easter god or something.
Yeah.
So, are you convinced that anyone else has had an interaction with God?
Well, if I was a Christian, I would say probably the apostles, That would
Okay,
be like the logical entailment of the position.
sure. Well, what do you think now?
Um, Again, well, this is the thing I said earlier. Like, I would be happy to come back another day where I've done like a good amount of research and I've got like a bunch of sources and we could talk about the history stuff. I lean toward the history stuff at the moment based on what I've seen, but I just don't know if I'm like comfortable presenting that position in public strictly.
Well, and I'm no expert on New Testament theology by any stretch of the means, but from my understanding is that a lot of the New Testament history stuff either relies on assuming that the Gospels are authentic, the authorship of the Gospels is authentic, where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were really written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and
Hmm.
John, but
Hmm.
scholars and the majority of scholars all agree that the Gospels are anonymous, and we have no good reason to believe that the names attributed to them in the year 185 is actually the correct authorship.
Yeah, so well, first of all, I hope you would understand why I would say that if we're having a discussion about history, like if that's the topic of discussion, what anybody else thinks is irrelevant, right? Like it's if we were having a casual conversation, then and you said, oh well, like virologists think vaccines work, I'd be like, well, that's fine. But if we were having a debate about vaccines, the fact that anybody else think like we would look at the evidence, right? So it's not relevant to me that the vast majority of New Testament scholars don't think that they would say that the Gospels are anonymous. I would say, well, you can say that. I just don't think my claim would be that New Testament scholars are overwhelmingly harsh with New Testament manuscripts in a way that no other historian ever is. Like they'll say like, well, you know, the Gospel of Mark, it doesn't say, I, Mark, am writing this to you. But if you look into ancient sources, that almost never happens, right? But we still attribute ancient sources to authors.
I mean, it happens a good amount. I mean, the works of Paul are attributed to
Yeah,
Paul. He self-identifies.
that's
In
true.
fact, there's good reason to believe that I think 6 of the works attributed to Paul were actually frauds. They were people claiming to be
Yeah,
Paul or claiming
again,
to speak for Paul, but they actually weren't. We
I've
don't have
looked
to get
into
into
this.
that, but it's just to point out
Not
that people
convinced.
back then and the works of Paul are older than the Gospels. They were the first works in the New Testament. So
Allegedly.
we have
That's
books
what.
that do claim authorship. Authors do claim authorship in the
Yeah,
books.
sure. So I'll make just 2 quick points about this. Again, I don't really want to get like deep into this right now, but just 2 quick responses, or maybe more. First of all, I think more than uh critical scholars believe. I think more Pauline epistles are authentic. I would say, probably like they say the pastoral epistles, so that would be First and Second Timothy and Titus. They would say those are not authentic. I would say there's no good evidence to say that. They say the Greek is like a little bit different, but you don't have a sufficient sample size to actually make a claim like that. You only have like a couple thousand words, I think, between all three.
Sure, and I don't want us to get too sidetracked into
Yeah,
whether
yeah,
Paul
yeah.
wrote certain books of the Bible or not, because it's not really relevant. But
Yeah, sure. There was just one more thing I wanted to say, which was that it's true Paul regularly identifies himself in the Pauline epistles, but he's writing letters. So if you look at ancient biographies, it's almost never the case, in that if you look at like the 100 years before and the 100 years after, and you take every biography written in that date range, and you look at like how many of these biographies, so that would be like the Gospels, right? They purport to be biographies. How many of these biographies start with, I, Josephus, am writing to you? It's almost none of them, right? Or I Tacitus, or any of these other ancient historians, I, Plutarch. None of them formally identify themselves within the text. It's always like something that you would find next to the text, like, Caesar according to Plutarch, something like that. I'm just making these examples up, but that's my understanding, is that biographies are almost never directly attributed within the text.
Yeah, and while it's true that an author could write a book and refer to himself in the third person, I mean, that's not necessarily unheard of. The disciples spoke probably Aramaic, but the Gospels were written in Greek, and so there are no known first century Palestinians that wrote in Greek.
I don't think that's true. Greek would have been the language of the entire Roman Empire. Like, it's what all trade, or a large amount of trade, would have been conducted in Greek. And then obviously the Old Testament, right? Jesus, I guess if you don't think the Gospels are reliable, at least whoever wrote the Gospels are quoting the Greek New Testament. But I guess it's obvious that whoever wrote them spoke Greek. But it doesn't preclude them from being accurate, because you could have someone like Mark who could hire, I think Arrowense. There's like some word for like someone you would hire to write things down for you, because not many people could write. It's not convincing to me, even if they couldn't speak Greek. It's not convincing to me that they couldn't have just gone out and paid someone a few shekels to like write down in Greek for them.
Yeah, and maybe that is possible. That's fair. But I mentioned this before. The very first time the Gospels were ever attributed to those authors was in 185 by Irenaeus in his work against heresies. And prior to that, there were many occasions where early church fathers in the first and second century, referred to the Gospels by other names or by no name. So like Justin Martyr, for example, calls them the memoirs of the apostles.
Yeah, right. But that's not different. Like, that's not someone with a text of the Gospel of Mark and saying this is the Gospel according to Thomas.
Right. Yeah. No, that's not what I mean. I don't mean, by a different name, like a different person. I just mean, he doesn't call it, this is the Gospel of Matthew. He says, this is the Gospel of the Lord. That was Didicki who said that. So, they're referring to them as anonymous names. And so what evidence could Irenaeus possibly have that these other people, First Clement, the Epistle of Barnabas, all these people who are writing about the Gospels before Irenaeus, what evidence did Irenaeus suddenly find in the year 185 that these other authors didn't have?
Well, hold on. First of all, this is like just because no one else, I don't know. This is another point where I would like to have, I don't want to stress this point too much, because like I don't have like manuscripts I could pull up and like prove you wrong. But it's notable, I think, amongst historians that none of the Gospels are ever misattributed, right? There is no Gospel of Mark with the header, Gospel according to Thomas. There is no Gospel of John with the header, Gospel according to Matthew. Like every instance and every direct quote, like there's never been a time, my understanding is, that they have been misattributed. So if they were like anonymous, then people, like if we think about Jesus's birthday, for example, in the early traditions, this is like heavily debated and everybody's like presenting a different view, but nobody's presenting a different view that like Mark was written by Peter. Well, That's dumb, actually, because Mark writes according to Peter, so I shouldn't have used that example. But, nobody says Mark was written by Luke, is my understanding of the available manuscripts.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with that. I've never seen evidence that a gospel was misattributed to a different author in the past. But I think that, calling it Gospel of the Lord or, Memoirs of the Apostles, all these other names that don't specify it to any particular author, I think is evidence for anonymous authorship, that there's no reason to not call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John if you do know that that's the author, because all you're doing is making your audience more confused by not referencing the actual name. So these names were only made up in the year 185.
I'm happy to come back in like a week.
Sure,
and we can
and
have a
I'm
much more
not
in-depth
necessarily pressing
conversation
you.
about this.
Yeah, that's fair.
I would just say I would dispute that, but we'll have to see, like, what
Yeah,
my
we
research
can
turns
save
out.
that one for next time. So,
Let's go.
since you're advocating for the Christian God, maybe we can get into a little bit of morality. So, I have some issues with the whole idea of covenant theology, this notion where God makes a worse set of rules on purpose for earlier humans, and then after a couple thousand years, he decides, I'm going to change a bunch of the rules, but I'll keep some of them the same because now people are better and more mature and they can handle these different rules, which are actually better and more moral. So, what do you have to say about covenant theology, and how is that? How does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's one thing that's like, this is going to frustrate the hell out of you, I think. But one thing I thought, like, as soon as I even started looking into this, I had a question, which was like, would I expect things that God does to be explainable to me? Not necessarily. So there are some things, like, if God said 2 + 2 is 5, I'd be like, okay, we're done. It's over. It's totally over. But then you're like, well, why does God make certain decisions? That's a really good question. Maybe there are people with answers. Maybe there aren't answers. But it's sort of like if I ask you, like, well, where does the Big Bang come from? And you're like, I don't know. It's just one of those open questions. It's like maybe one day I'll go ask him.
I think that there are certain things within morality that we could say are equivalent to 2 + 2 = 5 in the sense that they're
No.
completely contradictory. And that's assuming on the outset that we can have some sort of agreement on what morality means. So whenever I use the word morality, what I'm really talking about is actions which have consequences towards the well-being of thinking creatures, specifically humans. So if an action causes unnecessary harm or suffering, I would call that an immoral action. And the fact that God in the Bible very frequently causes unnecessary harm and suffering means he is immoral.
Yeah, so 2 things. The first thing is, even as an atheist my whole life, I was like, this objective morality stuff, no way. You just can't do it absent divine revelation. The
Well, I'm
second
not
thing would
advocating
be,
for objective morality. I just want to make that clear. My morality is ultimately subjective because
yeah,
well-being is a subjective goal that I have to set myself, and then I can make
yeah,
assessments based on that.
sure, okay. Then the second thing would be like, is well-being, even if I was an atheist or if I was a theist, it doesn't really matter. Is well-being, I don't think well-being was, maybe when I was like 12, but I don't think well-being has often been the goal I would set. Yeah, so that's, you can do with that what you will.
So, yeah, when you were an atheist prior to turning 20 years old, if you said something was moral or immoral, what would you say your implicit goal was? What's your implicit goal with your morality, or what was your implicit goal?
So usually I had like I wouldn't say it's a background, but when I was like 15, I started reading a bunch of ancient Stoic philosophy, which I found really interesting. And the argument that the Stoics present is basically that, like, you as a human should strive for the well-being of others. I'm not denying that, but the like net well-being is not the goal. So like the Stoics would say, for example, that it would be better to die than to lie. That's like an argument that Epictetus makes, because lying is immoral. And or like if somebody entrusts you with a secret and like the king comes to you and he's like, I want to chop your head off if you don't tell me. Epictetus says to surrender your like free will to the king would be worse than dying. So you have to like keep the secret. So that's a sense in which like I would disagree with the notion that like net well-being is the goal.
So your goal is more about, I mean, in the examples you gave, you're talking about honesty and like honor. You have to be honorable. You have to remain honest in all situations, even if it costs you your life.
Well, maybe not in all situations. So like a counterexample would be like if you're hiding Anne Frank, it's
Right. Up in
probably
your
more
attic. Yeah. And the
honorable to
Nazi and the,
lie.
you know, who comes knocking on your
Yeah,
door. Sure.
knocking on the door. But yeah, in terms of particularly like self-sacrifice, my argument would be that like what the Stoics would say is that you should live in accordance with nature. Nature's written with a capital N here, and it's about the human nature for like cooperation and consistency and helping each other. So this would mean like if somebody does an injustice to you, you shouldn't get angry at him, because getting angry at him is contrary to your nature. Even if it's natural in the sense that you evolved for it, but it's unnatural in the sense that it's contrary to human civilization. That would be the argument I would make when I was an atheist.
Sure. But I mean, when you're talking about like human civilization, the prosperity of human civilization and cooperation, I mean, those are your implicit goals. I mean, that's to me sounds a lot like well-being. Your goal is the well-being of human civilization, right?
No, it kind of it derives the other way, I think, where it's like humans are social creatures. Maybe not. Like you don't even need to be in a society to be a social creature. You could live in like a little tribe.
Yeah, I mean, either
Humans
way,
are
yeah,
social
you're in a
creatures.
society, sure.
Yeah, they're made to work together, and so to violate that is violating nature, and living in accordance with nature is the Stoic ideal.
Well, I
But it's
think
not.
if your goal in morality is strictly the well-being of human, or sorry, the promotion of human civilization, but you don't necessarily make well-being a priority, then I think there's a lot of things that, things that you might agree are immoral that are in the best interest of furthering human civilization, like doing unethical scientific tests on humans, for example. So we could, maybe spare a couple dozen, a few hundred humans and give them, debilitating diseases or unalive them, but
Learn a
for the
lot.
betterment of human society in the long run.
Yeah. But the Stoic argument would be that humans are born. I can read you a passage if you'd like from Meditations, but the argument is that humans are born to work together. Marcus Aurelius says like we're born to work together like two pairs of, like the pairs of hands and feet, or like the two rows of teeth, upper and lower, right? Like we're born to work together. So if you're kidnapping someone and experimenting on them, you're not working with them. So it's still contrary to nature.
Great. So if
But
the ultimate
this is what I
pillar,
believed as a Stoic.
sure,
We're kind of beyond that
yeah,
these
and
days.
if human civilization is, a good, and the promotion of it is good for, that's a moral good, and we can associate that with morality. If God violated or somehow put a detriment to the cooperation of humans, could we then say that God acted in an immoral way?
That's the argument I would have made as an atheist. The problem, as soon as you get into theism, is that, as they say, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away.
Right. I mean, those are statements of things that he does, but that doesn't mean he's justified in every time that he takes something away. A story from the Bible that pops up in my head is the Tower of Babel, where humans on their own were intrigued by the idea of cooperation. They wanted to work together and create a big tower so all humans can easily find them. And then they were really valuing teamwork, cooperation for this big shared goal of, connecting all humans together. And God looked at it and said, no, 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 I can't have you guys cooperating in a society. I'm going to intentionally confuse your language and, drive a bunch of you away so that, people are scattered all over the world, because humans recognize that we're more powerful when we stick together. And God said, I can't have that. I've got to create dysfunction in their society.
Mm-hmm. First of all, obviously, coming from an atheist background, I would say that most of the stories in Genesis are allegorical, right? So I don't think that there ever was a Tower of Babel. The second thing I would say is my understanding of the story of the Tower of Babel is that they're like trying to build their way to heaven or some shit. Like they're not.
It never actually says that.
Okay, well, I'd have to read the text. I can't say I've gotten up to that bit yet.
But even if that was their motivation, God should know that that's impossible because he exists in an alternate dimension. He's not literally up in the clouds. So he has nothing to fear from them building a tall tower. I mean, we've been to the moon and back and never passed heaven on the way.
Yes, that is true. But let me just think about how I'm going to phrase this. I'm very tired.
Sure,
my dog
you're good.
peed on my bed last night. And then, so I lost 3 hours of sleep because I had to wash and dry everything right before I went to bed.
Oh, I hate that. Whenever my cat pukes all the time and he'll do a mess on the floor at night, and then it's like, oh, and you step on it, and then you slip around a little bit, and it's a bad time.
Oh God.
Now, I was going to ask, since you said that you think a lot of these Genesis stories, like the Tower of Babel, is allegorical, what's the moral lesson we should bring from the Tower of Babel story?
Well, the typical interpretation is that you really ought not make yourself to be like God, or you shouldn't try to do some work to reach like a certain level and put yourself equal with God, right?
I suppose so, but I mean, if my memory is not failing me, which I don't think it is, that's never mentioned as the motivation for the people, or even mentioned at all in the story whatsoever. I'm pulling out the Tower of Babel.
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
me too.
Looks like it's in Genesis chapter 11. Yeah, the whole world had one common language. People moved in and settled there. They said, "Come, let's make bricks
to the heavens."
Oh yes, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the earth. So the way I would interpret that is that when they say build a tower that reaches the heavens, they're saying build a tower that reaches really high up into the clouds, the heavens, so that people around are able to find them, because it says otherwise we will be scattered over the whole earth. So they want to make this like the human capital of the world, so that everyone can come see, and then everyone comes and finds them, so that they can all work together and live together.
You can say that. So there are three things I'd have to say.
And then if we look ahead to what God's response to the tower, he says, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language. So God just doesn't want them to be successful. He says nothing will be impossible for them. They can accomplish anything, but we can't have human flourishing. We can't have humans being successful. We have to put an end to that.
Mm-hmm. I would need to know like Hebrew to be able to answer this question. It does somewhat hinge on whether the heavens there is like talking about something divine or just like the clouds. Let me read this text again.
It's also interesting that God says, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language." But it makes it seem a little bit polytheistic.
Yeah, we'll again a conversation for another day.
And it's also interesting. Yeah, that's fair. But I think it's also worth pointing out, and another bit we can save for another day, is how a lot of the plural language that God uses, the plural pronouns, get lost in later books of the Bible. So it starts off more polytheistic, and then it drifts closer and closer to monotheism as time goes on.
Well,
Which my understanding is that's how Yahweh worship started, was that originally Yahweh was like the son of the main god, and Yahweh is, and Moloch, for example, are brothers, and that's why he's jealous of everyone worshiping Moloch, because he doesn't want people to worship his older brother.
yeah, so people say this. I don't think that the evidence is like anywhere even near conclusive on that. The I've seen videos about this. I was just right before we talked, I was just about to watch a video kind of responding to a video about that. So unfortunately I'm ill prepared. But what people often say, what Christians often say about that is that, like, when God says we, he's talking about him and the angels, not other gods.
That's fair. Yeah, it's interesting too how Genesis skips the part where God makes angels. You have this entire race of superhumans, like flying immortal beings that are way more powerful than humans. If there was just one angel that existed, we would probably think that was God. But then Genesis just skips the part where God makes them. But then later on, God sends an angel to guard the entrance of the Garden of Eden. So we know that he had to have made them. And even the author of Genesis acknowledges angels, but just skips their creation. I just find that interesting.
Well, in my view, it's just not relevant. Like, when I read the creation accounts in Genesis, like Genesis 1, for example, and then I think the start of Genesis 2 as well, it's all one creation account, and then the end of Genesis 2 has a slightly different one.
Oh no, we're going to have to get into the contradictions surrounding the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 creation accounts now.
But to me, these are just moral stories, right? So the first creation account is just about the nature of the universe being good. So, like, God, separates the waters from the waters, and he's like, good job, that's good. And then he creates people, and well, there's a lot in between, but he's like creating the animals and the earth, and he's like, it's all good, right? Like, it's kind of like, it's like anti-Gnosticism, right? If I don't know how much you know about Gnosticism, but it's the idea that, like, the created world is like evil and we're all stolen from the true God and blah blah blah. But Genesis is like, no, it's good. This is a good world to live in.
Yeah, and it does also seem to lean towards divine command theory, where God is deciding things are good, and he's not just recognizing that something is inherently good. He's saying, I declare that waters being separated from each other are a good thing. And it's really, that to me, that seems more amoral and not so much moral, because in my head, morality has strictly to do with human interactions. I mean, if I see a lion attacking a zebra, I don't think I'm in any, I wouldn't be justified in calling that moral or immoral. It's just the way that nature is. And, just, it doesn't have to do with human behavior. And I think that when most people talk about morality, the effects on human lives are really the only thing that's important.
That is fair, but I mean, I don't see any objection to divine command theory that somebody could come up with. Like, if it's true, then it's true, right?
Well, sure, I don't think divine command theory is necessarily incoherent, but I think that it's, maybe it's incoherent in the way that morality in that case would just be God's subjective opinion, that he's just deciding things are moral or immoral. And that's what we do too. That's what I do. So I decide that, if I see someone stealing something from a homeless man, I would say that's immoral behavior because you're causing them unnecessary suffering. But then, if God says that, slavery is good, then that's him making a moral pronouncement. And I would say I disagree with his opinion.
Yeah, right. But so I have a question for you. I don't know if you know what these terms mean. But would you call yourself an ethical cognitivist or non-cognitivist?
I am not familiar with those terms.
Yeah, so it's an unbelievably redundant term. The only question is, do you think that moral claims can be true? Like, can they be evaluated for truth? Or are they just like even if you're a subjectivist, do you think that moral claims are just expressions of emotion, or do you think that they are genuine expressions about the way the world ought to be?
I'd probably lean more towards the second one. I tend to stay away from And I know Alex O'Connor's definition of morality has
Yeah, I
more
don't
to
like it
do
very
with
much.
emotion, like appealing to
Yeah,
intuition.
yeah.
And
Ethical
my
motivism.
understanding of morality has a lot more to do with the effects that we can observe, objectively about reality. So, like if I take a knife and put it into someone's neck, I can observe the fact of reality that they bleed and die and feel tons of pain. And if we can agree that morality entails the preservation and promotion of well-being, then clearly making someone not alive anymore in a really painful way against their consent is immoral. So I would say that if we agree on the definition of morality, then we can make truth statements about it.
Sure. So you think that it's possible? I mean, yeah, you would say it's possible for moral claims to be evaluated for truth then?
Yes, if we can
Yeah.
agree on what the definition of morality is, because whether it's true or not hinges on that definition.
Sure. Would you say, just under a theistic worldview, that morality has truth value even absent your agreement to it? Like, let me make a case to you, okay? Um, if God is this is an internal belief. I'm not like trying to convince you that God exists or anything, but I'm saying that if God did exist, then it would be true under like the classical nature of God that he's saying true things. And so when God says things like, and it was good, whether or not you think that morality is even separate from God and he's just saying it, or if it's true because he's saying it, in either case, it is actually true, right? It has to be.
I think that, and I promise I'm not doing this to weasel out of the question, but I
We'll
think that
see.
I may actually change my response. That the more I ponder it, if I say that a moral action is true or a moral evaluation is true, it's only true relative to my opinion about it. And ultimately, we're all relying on our opinion. And if I say that this is moral, like I could say something God did in the Bible is immoral because
Mhm.
he's violating my understanding of the promotion of well-being. But then if God disagrees or if you disagree, how do we tell which one of us is actually right? So, or if any of us are actually right. But I mean, yeah,
But the
I don't know.
claim I'm making is that if God exists and he only says true things, then it would necessarily entail that when he says and it was good, it doesn't matter if you disagree or not. It's a fact. It becomes a fact of the world. And that might be that there's some objective morality separate from God and he's just telling you about it. This is like the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Like, is it, or maybe it's just true because he's saying it. But in either case, the fact that he's saying it indicates that it's true, regardless of your mind.
Yeah, I would say that that creates a paradox where that particular God is logically impossible. Where so
Why?
I think the only gods that could exist are either one who lies and says that he can't tell a lie and then he says something is good but he's lying, or a god who if he truly cannot lie and God has to always tell the truth, then that God would be incapable of ever saying you may buy slaves. So the things that the biblical God does are incompatible with the idea that God can't say something that isn't true.
Sure, but first of all, I'm just talking about the nature of like God classically. I'm not like tying it to any particular God. I'm just saying that like theism or deism kind of would necessarily lead to things that God's saying about morality being true, right? Whether or not you think it's any particular God isn't relevant.
Well, I mean, when I'm talking about God, generally I'm referring to the one of the Bible, but
Yeah,
yeah, just
sure.
in a basic sense, if we say that there is a God who can't lie and he is capable of making moral pronouncements,
Hmm.
um, and then it kind of boils down to maybe he's not lying, he's saying this is good, but he's appealing to his own opinion of what good is. So in that sense, I guess I would lean more towards the idea that good and bad morality is not tied necessarily to an objective truth, but it's a subjective opinion.
Yeah, that's pretty, I don't know how I would say, concerning for me. Uh, because when you
Well,
say you have an issue with things in the Bible like slavery, but you admit then that your only issue becomes essentially a matter of preference, that it is your preference that you believe that, slavery is wrong, but there's no mind independent or human mind independent fact that you can point to that would actually say that.
yeah, I think that's fair because morality, and when we start saying like, oh, it's just like your subjective opinion and it's just your personal preference, I think that might be downplaying how important personal preferences are. And when we're talking about morality, I think ultimately that's what it boils down to is people prefer life over death. They prefer health over disease, joy over sadness, pleasure over pain, or wisdom over ignorance. So if we have these preferences, then we can say that things are good or bad based on those. And I think we all do that. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that so long as we can agree on what the foundation for life and morality are, then we can come to, more agreement about how we can best serve the well-being of humans. And if someone's goal is not the well-being of humans, then I really don't have any interest in what their version of morality is. And if God's version of morality, or if any God out there's version of morality entails things that cause unnecessary harm and suffering to humans, then I would say I have no interest in that.
Yeah, but then I would just say conversely, if you have a system of morality, so for example, you said, well, people like prefer, pleasure and happiness, and let's say probably material goods even, although maybe that's not true and they just don't know it. Maybe material goods make people sad, but they certainly act as if they prefer material goods. And so that's a great argument that you can make within a society that seems to be running pretty smoothly. But let's imagine that like everything went into anarchy, and I'm just like, well, like I want free stuff, so I'm just going to enslave my neighbor because that's going to make me richer. Like people don't really, absent cultural conditioning, have a preference against other people being hurt. It's like, it seems that the arc of history would suggest that people's preferences really are almost entirely selfish. So when you say things like, well, yeah, like if we can agree that everyone deserves all these things, like, yeah, sure. But what happens when we can't agree? And then if your claim is going to be that you said like you have no interest in a God that would like make certain prescriptions. My counter would be, I have no interest in a worldview that can't make certain prescriptions.
Yeah, I want to address some of the earlier stuff you said. When we're building a society, and you brought up the issue of what if certain people don't care about the well-being of everyone? What if they're selfish? What if they only care about themselves? What if
Yeah.
you wanted to enslave your neighbor to prop up your own wealth at their expense? I think if we're going to be building a society of cooperation, which benefits everyone, then we have to put ourselves under the veil of ignorance when we're thinking about what kind of laws and regulations we should make up. Because if I make a society where I'm like, I'm really selfish, so I think it'd be cool if I was in charge and everyone else did what I said and served me all my food for free, and they did my nails for me and they did my hair, and I could just watch TV all day and I didn't have to work. That might be the best society for me, but that's assuming I'm the one who's in charge. So if I was setting up a society with under the impression I would be placed as a random individual within the society, then I would want one where we're all under more or less equal footing with equal opportunity, and where there's certain laws that prohibit behaviors which cause harm, like enslaving people. Because if I promote a society that allows slavery, then what if I'm the slave? I wouldn't like that. So, the selfish thing only works if you're the one person who's in charge. But as soon as you start advocating for a society that allows slavery, you now put yourself at risk of becoming oppressed.
Yeah, but this this argument only works from the veil of like, I'm not under a veil of ignorance, right? So again, I'm just asking, like, if everything went into anarchy, and let's imagine, I mean, I live in Australia, so I don't, but let's imagine I had a firearm and no one else did. Like, what argument could you possibly give me, given that I actually am at the top, to not just do whatever I want?
Well, I would say if that happens and you start trying to put yourself in charge, for one, Australia is a big place. Maybe there's another gun or two somewhere in the whole continent.
Yeah,
So at that point,
let's just say in my suburb, right?
sure. Well, and if there's what it leads to, like say if you become the king of your block in your little
Yeah.
town, you're the only person with a god, you're in charge. Someone else from a neighboring town who might be the leader over there sees you and thinks, I want to conquer this king's town and I want to have twice as many houses that I'm in charge of. So, we start having this mess of a bunch of leaders who are all in charge fighting over land and resources at the expense of the vast majority of people, the peasants who live underneath them. And but eventually the peasants rose up, the rise of the middle class. So we said, hey, instead of having an elite few and a poor many, maybe we could even the playing ground and then make life better for everyone. And a lot of people in modern day middle class live like kings did thousands of years ago, just because since we've cooperated and worked together, we've been able to achieve so much more scientifically. Technology is so much better now. So, I mean, life improves for everyone when we work together.
Yeah, well, there are a few things I would say. I'm pretty sure the rise of the middle class is itself a result of technology and not the other way around. But the point you're making, though, is still just an appeal to me, right? So you're saying, if I could know that, for example, I wasn't going to be overthrown, like if I had a sufficiently strong and loyal army of guards, there is nothing you could appeal to, because the only thing you're appealing to right now is that, well, if you're like the top ape and you're really mean to all the other apes, they're just going to tear you limb from limb, which is what happens with chimpanzees who are too oppressive, right? But you're still, like, what you're saying is like, so it's in my interest to be like sort of as oppressive as I can get away with, without so oppressive that people are gonna think it's worth risking their life to take me out.
Sure. And, a lot of people do think like that, which is why for a huge portion of human history, we had monarchies instead of democracies where, there is an elite few that's ruling over many and, just as oppressive as they can possibly get without their subjects revolting and overthrowing or assassinating their king. And oftentimes that did happen because kings would push the boundaries beyond what their subjects wanted, and then there'd be uprising and riots, and then there'd be a new king, and then the whole situation repeats until finally we have democracy where now the people are in charge of their own leadership. And I don't think anyone can ever be completely confident that they're never going to lose their seat of power. And I think in order to feel fulfilled in that seat of power, you have to lack a certain amount of empathy for your fellow human beings. And I certainly would not want to be a ruthless leader against people. I want to be co-equal. I want to be the equal to my friends. I don't want to be their leader who tells them what to do. It's not interesting to me.
Yeah, but the only point I'm making is that earlier you said you have like no interest in a god who makes certain prescriptions that are against your preference. But my counterpoint is I have no interest in a philosophy that has no capability to tell me that if I'm top king, I can't just pick one guy out of a million and kill him, right? Because the other 999,000 don't care. Like, they're probably not going to die. So like people wouldn't like revolt over something like that. I mean, kings did it all the time. So I'm not, if your ethical philosophy is essentially just an appeal to my own well-being, I'm not sure I'm interested in a philosophy like that.
I mean, to me, it's nuts that you wouldn't care about your own well-being.
I agree. Well, hold on. No. I'm not saying I don't care about my own well-being. I'm saying your appeal to me, if we imagine I'm dictator, you're saying you shouldn't oppress people because this bad thing will happen to you. It's like, yeah, sure. But what if I just oppress him a little bit, you know? There's no appeal you can make anymore. But under a religious worldview of some kind, there usually is an appeal you can make.
Well, in the society that we're living in right now, at least the one I'm in, I am completely incapable of just making myself top dog. If I just decided I'm going to oppress everyone around me, eventually I'd find myself in jail and I would be being oppressed by society, because we find ourselves in a society that's huge and complex where dissenters and people that don't follow the rules get put behind bars, and you're not allowed to play with other people if you're not going to play by our preset rules. And that's just the world that we find ourselves in. And I'm not necessarily saying that's right or wrong, but this whole idea of, oh, what if I just become king and then I don't need to care about anyone else? It's like, to me, that doesn't seem like a realistic option. I mean, we have no choice but to try to live cooperatively in the societies that we're currently in.
Right. But the only point I'm making is that your appeals are always to my own self-interest. And so I could come up with an infinite number of examples where I think something genuinely wrong could happen, and yet there's no appeal you can make to my own self-interest for why I shouldn't do it. Like, I'll give you a real simple example.
Sure.
Like if somebody, even within our own society, if somebody like commits adultery, which, by the way, I think should probably be illegal, but if it happens,
strong disagreement from me.
So just in the context of a marriage, I think that a marriage is a contract, and so it would be a contract violation in my view. Like if you've agreed to be faithful to someone. In girlfriend boyfriend, I think that's more complicated, but in any case,
I don't think the government has any business getting into the bedrooms of people and that, having court cases deciding, oh, you gave me a hall pass, and then, oh, but then you saw her twice. And, it gets so messy when the government starts getting involved in people's, what happens behind closed doors.
In an ideal world, I think it should be illegal, but I guess maybe
I still disagree, even though I think even though I think that adultery is incredibly immoral, I still would never advocate for it being illegal, because I don't think sex between two consenting adults should ever result in criminal charges. If you're not,
what about civil charges though?
I don't think it's any of the government's business to get involved with what happens in the bedroom with consenting adults.
Well, that's a conversation for another day. But the point I'm just making is that
you can say, was that the example you had? Yeah.
No. Well, the example I was going to give is that, like, if I could prove that I could cheat on my girlfriend and she wouldn't know, then there's no appeal you can make to my own self-interest for it to not happen. In fact, appeals to my own self-interest would argue that I should do it because it would make me happy and it would hurt no one.
Yeah. And in that situation, what I would say is that if you don't feel bad about your significant other being cheated on and being lied to, then you need to take a look at yourself and think, am I really a good partner for them? If I don't actually care about being honest and open and respecting them, then maybe they would be better off without me. And if you lack empathy for them, then I would say that you're being a bad partner.
Yeah, but I don't see what appeal you could make under a worldview that can't make objective appeals. I don't see what you would point to say that, like if she's happy and I'm happy, what's the problem? Under your worldview, where well-being is everything. Well,
in my, from what I've observed, affairs rarely go undiscovered. At some point, the beans are spilled, and then that's when the feelings get hurt. So I would say that there's no way that you can possibly know that they'll never find out about it. So in that way, it's not in your best interest to do it, because it's going to lead to, your well-being being ended. If you're happy in your marriage, then you shouldn't cheat on your spouse, because that will probably lead to either the end or the disruption of the trust in your marriage.
I would agree. So I saw Jordan Peterson, who I'm sure you don't like, but I saw him once say something like, in his 20 years as a clinical psychologist, he never saw anyone get away with anything, which I thought was really interesting. I think the idea partly is that even if no one notices, like, it'll corrupt you, and it'll it'll lead you down a dark path where eventually someone will find out about something else you've done. But but even like, I hope you understand that you're still just appealing to me, right? So like
Well,
this, you're only saying that I shouldn't do it because, let's be honest, in reality, probably there will be some effect, but that's not an appeal to the nature of the act itself being wrong.
right. And I don't think any action is inherently or objectively wrong. They're only wrong because of the effect they have on people. So if you're, well, yeah, I'll leave it at that. See what you have to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why you feel that way, but it's just, I'm just trying to tie this in with earlier when you said like you have no interest in a system where a god might make a certain pronouncement that goes against your morals. Well, I'm like, well, I have no interest in a system where you can't make pronouncements like lying to people is in and of itself immoral, absent even any harm it might cause.
Well, you already agreed earlier that lying is not always wrong. It's situational. So there's situations where lying is the best option and situations where it's not the best option.
Yeah, well, it's only the best option when you're doing it against like bad people, as far as I can tell. Like I'm not opposed to like spies, for example. Like spies have a function, but it's because you're employing them as a tactic against evil.
I mean, in a situation where countries are using spies, there's usually some blame on both sides. Rarely is there ever a
Yeah,
country that's
probably.
pure evil and the other one's pure good. If you ask either one of them, they'll say they're the good guys.
Yeah, I would agree. But it's just, the point I'm making is like, I agree that, um, for example, when you get down to it and you've got two competing interests that are unresolvable, and if you think that your one's good, then it's like, hey, lie away. But if we're talking about within a society, then, or like where you're not dealing with something that you think is actually evil, I would say that like lying to good people is bad. Doing bad things to good people is bad. But the problem that I have is that every appeal you're making is just that, like, well, in the world we live in, probably it'll come back to bite you. And I agree, by the way. I'm not saying, I would say it's very, very likely that either your partner would find out, or it would lead you to do something else, because it would like degrade the view that you have of your partner, and there would be some effect for it, and you'd end up paying the price.
Sure. Yeah.
But
Well,
in that case, we're still just talking about the price being paid and not the act itself.
you said earlier that you have no interest in a moral system that doesn't make pronouncements like such and such is wrong. So I'm wondering, how do we know what moral pronouncements are? How do we know which things are moral and which things aren't? Where are we getting this information?
Well, it's a good question. If I would say, on the balance of probabilities, the Bible. I know you're going to have an issue with that.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Oh
Because,
yeah,
well, and especially if we look at the Old Testament, because the Bible
yeah,
is two
sure,
testaments. So then we have
yeah.
to assume everything in the Old Testament is moral. So,
Mhm.
we have verses which condemn adultery, which we would
Based.
probably agree with. But then we have passages where God has women sexually assaulted as a punishment for something that somebody else did. So, and I
I
think
don't think I've
hopefully we
ever
would both
seen that
agree
one.
that that's immoral. Sorry, what'd you say?
I don't think I've ever seen that one. I think I might know what passage you might be referring to, but we'll see.
Sure. Well, there's two parts in Deuteronomy 28:30. God lays out, he's the context is he's laying out a list of curses and punishments he has in store for people that break his rules. One of
Yeah.
them is you will be pledged to marry a woman, but another will take her and grape her.
Yep.
So, this is God promising to do it. And then he puts this promise in action. I believe it might be in one of the Samuels, in a story about King David. God punishes David by having his wife and concubines sexually assaulted.
Hold on. What was the other one? I see 2830.
Yeah, 28:30. Let me try to pull up the source for the other one. I think it might be 2 Samuel 15.
I'll have to pull this up in a new tab.
Or at least that's what popped up on Google. Let's see if that's a good starting point.
I'm sure it's close enough.
Do you think if that is what happens in the story, that would be a big problem?
Hold on. For 28:30 or for 2 Samuel?
In 2 Samuel.
Okay, I gotta read this. Can you remind me what you said? It said, or maybe if it doesn't say it here, maybe it says it somewhere else.
Yeah, my understanding was that God was mad at David so that he had David's wife raped.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry I don't have the reference handy.
It's all right.
But don't you think even if we just look at Deuteronomy 28, don't you think it's problematic that God promises to do this? I mean, he says that he plans on doing it if you break any of his rules. So if you eat even just one piece of shrimp, he's going to coordinate and orchestrate the grape of your girlfriend. I mean, isn't that kind of a horrible thing to do for something that you did?
It's an interesting question. So the problem, like, there are two or three threads running at the same time here. The first one is, would I believe in absolute divine command theory, which I'm not sure yet. The second thing is, even if that was true, and I'm like, wow, that's really difficult for me to reconcile. Is it more difficult for me to reconcile that there's no such thing as morality in any objective sense? I would say, yeah, probably. So, like, there's nothing I don't think you could point me to where you're like, look at this bad thing God does. And I'm like, okay, I think I would still rather believe in that than believe that, like, I have no basis for saying that anything is wrong at all.
Well, when you say you have a basis for saying something is wrong, all you're doing is using God's opinion as your basis. So you're just saying, I agree with this guy, therefore I'm justified in saying things are objectively wrong. But God, if he does exist, has no better justification for his opinions than any of the rest of us do.
But I've already laid out to you that if God says something, then it's true. So when God says, like, he made the humans and it was very good, like, that's a true statement. If God exists, then that would be a true statement absent your opinion, right?
Sure, but if the word good doesn't have any truth value to it, but it's strictly a word of value judgment, then God is just saying his opinion by claiming something is good.
Yeah, that's fair enough. But then I feel like you're not addressing the issue that I have, which is, like, that absent God, like, you can make an argument, maybe I can't, but people would, that God has, like, an objective standard for morality, or that God is the objective standard for morality. And then if absent God, you can't provide that, like, that's the issue that I have.
Well, I agree that I can't provide an objective standard for morality, but I don't think God is an objective standard for morality because it's just his opinion. And ultimately, it's not even God's opinion. It's just the opinions of men claiming to speak for God, because we have no reason to believe the people who wrote the Bible and claimed to know what God said and what God did and what God wants. We have no reason to believe that they're actually accurate.
I guess from an atheistic worldview, sure.
Well, from any worldview, like if in Genesis, when before any human existed on earth and God said this grass is good, how did the author know that happened?
I get what you're getting at, but then this is where I'm like, this is where we need presuppositions, right?
You mean assuming that like God is giving divine revelation to the Bible authors?
Yeah. But I don't want to rehash the argument particularly. But I'm just saying if that's where we were going, that's where I would take it.
I suppose at that point it kind of pulls into question the whole idea of biblical metaphorism or metaphorical books in the Bible, which you said you agree with. You agree that Genesis and the other earlier books are not literal. But if people are getting information directly from God, then why is God telling lies to people?
He's
Because
not.
I think that in order to say that the Old Testament books are not literal is also to deny that even the Gospels are literal. Because in the Gospel of or the Book of Acts and what was the other one? Luke, I think. It lays out the genealogy of Jesus and includes characters from Genesis, like Abraham, and then one of them includes characters even before that, all the way back to Adam. So if these people never existed, then those genealogies have to be untrue.
Well, they would be even in that. Well, first of all, I'm not sure if the Abrahamic story is metaphorical or not. I haven't looked into it, but the sure the end part of the genealogy is just like wrapping it all the way in with the Torah, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. Well, it just means it depends what you mean by truth, and it depends on what you mean by like metaphor and what you mean by lie, right? Like if I tell my
Sure.
girlfriend that her eyes are, stars in the night sky, it's like, am I lying to her?
I would say if I make the claim Jesus's great 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 etc. grandfather was Adam, the same Adam from the Genesis story. If that character didn't actually exist in our reality as a historical figure, then that claim is a lie.
I don't think so. I could imagine like if I had someone's whole family tree and then I just like put Adam at the front and like all the biblical characters at the front, uh, they would understand what I mean, even if I'm not saying that they actually existed.
Well, it's an unbroken genealogy. Every single piece
Yeah.
in the genealogy is there. So at some point, you're saying this person had a son whose name was this, and that in itself is a lie if it's not true. At some point, it goes from fictitious characters to real characters.
Yes.
And so if you make the claim, you know, so and so is such and such's father, that's a lie if it's not the actual case.
But if it's not meant to be taken literally, I mean, we have, I think maybe even pre-Christian rabbis, but certainly post-Christ and pre-evolution scholars. Like I think maybe Augustine. You have Christians all the way going back to Augustine, I think, saying the Genesis account is not literal, right?
Sure, but then you also have to believe that Luke and Acts are not literal either.
That the genealogy's in them, sure,
Yeah,
that's fine.
sure. Well, and I think that calls into question everything else in the books. If the authors are going to
I
include
don't think
things that
so.
aren't true, then that puts all of their claims in, in under a lot, should put a lot of their claims under scrutiny.
You're welcome to say that, but I mean, the first thing I would say is like I don't think a lot of the Genesis stories even read as literal, right? Like Genesis 1, what's the emphasis in Genesis 1, right? What's repeated over and over? It was good, it was good, it was good. I don't think that it reads like a literal story. I think it
Sure, and
reads
I honestly don't think the
metaphorically.
author intended it to be a literal story either. Yeah, but I mean, a huge portion of modern Christians believe it is, which I think is a big problem.
It is a big problem. Like, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying I don't think that the existence of metaphor, even if that metaphor is then repeated later, I don't think that is a problem. Like I don't disagree that you could argue that every passage in the Bible you need to think about it and ask yourself like, did this really happen? Did this really happen? Is this a metaphor? But I mean, especially when you're talking about the gospel accounts,
If the
you
Bible's
could you could
if the Bible so loosely includes metaphor and fact and mixes the two together with no discernment to us as the audience, which is which, then we have no reason to believe anything in it actually happened. We have to call into question every single claim that the Bible makes, especially even if, New Testament books like Acts and Luke are including fictitious ideas. So they're mixing fact and fiction as
but
well. So
then when
even
you
within
say
a book, there could
fictitious, I don't
be,
think metaphors are fictitious.
if you,
I think that your framing is unfair.
I think that a metaphor is it's fiction. A metaphor could be fiction. So I can say I make up a fiction story and it's a metaphor for some moral lesson. So like, the creation story, it's like a metaphor for where morals come from and why humans wear clothes. And so these are
Sure.
like the moral lessons that we can derive from the story. And I think
Yeah.
that you're right. The author probably didn't intend anyone to take it as literal history, but people do because it's ambiguous and it does make the claim this is the account of God creating the heavens and the earth in the beginning, such and such. So it can easily be interpreted as actual history. And I think it's only because of modern science and our observations that directly contradict it that so many Christians are reinterpreting the story to be metaphorical.
You can say that, but like I said, I'm pretty sure we have many records of I guess you could say pre-Darwin Christians going back even 1,000 years before Darwin, who are saying that this story is not a literal account and that it shouldn't be taken literally. I think the notion even that it should be taken literally, I don't know the history behind this, but it seems to be like a very American thing. Like American evangelicals seem uniquely rooted in their belief that it's literal in a way that I don't think any other Christian group in like the United Kingdom or in Australia take it quite that far.
Well, you do. Australia did generate Ken Ham, who's the leader of
Oh, I don't
Answers in
like that
Genesis.
guy. He's a knob.
He is kind of a knob. I like that word, but
Yeah.
you said earlier you're not sure if Abraham actually existed and if the stories that happen to him are real.
Yeah, I'd have to check. Like, I'm only saying that because, like, tentatively, I'd say probably, but then I'm like, just I don't know. I haven't actually looked into
Probably
any of
real,
that
you
at all.
mean?
Yeah, but I don't know.
Sure, and that's fair. But there's a lot of really outlandish stuff that happens to Abraham. For example, he gets visited by God in the flesh. The physical body of God appears to Abraham. They have a chat. They
One sec,
have a
sorry.
lunch together, and then God tells Abraham his plan about committing complete genocide on Sodom. And then Abraham's like,
One sec, I
"No,
gotta
my
go. I'm
my
sorry, I've got
nephew or
15
brother or
seconds.
whoever lives there, my friend, my family member Lot. I think it was his nephew, right, or my uncle. I don't know. They were related, but then Abraham haggles with God and gets him down from 50 righteous people in the city, and then I won't destroy it. And then Abraham's like, well, what if there's like 25 righteous people? Okay, well, what if there's like 21 righteous people? And then they go all the way down to 10. And then I guess God stormed off, and then he wasn't interested in getting it down below 10, which is also interesting because the implication of that is that if the city only had 9 righteous people, God would still wipe them out along with everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I only bring that up to say there's some really wacky stuff that happens in the book of Genesis, and that's only getting started with the Sodom story. We haven't even gotten to the hellfire raining down and the,
Yeah,
Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt.
yeah, the it's in. I've been thinking about the sort of whittling down of the numbers in the Abrahamic story. Sometimes I wonder, is the implication, and it doesn't say it, so I'm just thinking, but I thought this even the first time I read it, like, is the implication that there are none? Because, like, I don't think I think Abraham is, like, satisfied with 10. He's like, that's right, I can find 10. But the implication to me was always that, like, you could go as low as you wanted and it wouldn't matter. That's one reading of the story. I don't think it's the typical reading, but that's how I've thought about, or that's something I've thought about ever since I first read it.
The story to me definitely points to a God who's not omniscient, because after after Abraham and God agree to the 10 righteous people, God sends 2 angels to investigate the city. So they're going around looking for righteous people. And so why would God need to investigate anything if he's already omniscient? He would already know. And the whole haggling thing with Abraham is a big waste of time. If God already knows that there's 4 righteous people in the city, which is the number he ended up saving in the end, then what's the point of all the haggling? It's also, go ahead. Sorry.
I don't think God is running out of time, to be honest. I think he's fine to have a little conversation. I don't think that's like contrary to his nature, that he's just having a little chat, you know? I mean, you could why doesn't every time God wants to like tell someone something, why doesn't he just brain blast them with it? I don't know. But I don't think that that's like a strong case against it.
Well, I think that it's not necessarily the conversation that Abraham had with God is a strong case against omniscience, but I think that the fact that God has to send people to Sodom to look around is an argument against omniscience. And that goes along with the idea that the God character evolves over time, where in Genesis, he doesn't have all the qualities that he ends up getting, by our modern understanding of Christianity, where the triomnies haven't been imbued into God yet.
Yeah, fair. But then it's like when you say like, why does God have to send things to investigate? Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he just wants to, or maybe he just wants us to understand that he understands. But none of this is in my view necessarily contrary to like the typical understanding of God.
Would you say that there's anything God has ever done in the Bible that you would qualify as immoral?
That's a good question. So I'll give you this. The bit in, I don't know what book it is. I'm sure you know. I have like not a huge moral opposition to most of the slavery stuff in the Bible, but then there's just that one bit about like buying slaves from the nations around you.
Yeah,
like,
that's Leviticus
weird.
25:44.
Yeah, that one I've had to think about for a while.
The slavery bit, I think, actually gets a lot worse than that in other passages. You're probably familiar with Exodus 21, where God says, you may beat your slaves with a rod so long as they can get up and walk within 2 days, and then there's no punishment for the master. But another instance where God explains how to find slaves, how to acquire slaves, is in Deuteronomy 20, where God says, any city that's nearby, you can march up to and give them a peace offering. You can say, here, guys, you can either be our slaves and do forced labor, or we'll run into your town, kill all the men, and force the women and children to be slaves anyway. So your choice is be a slave or die if you're a man, and if you're a woman or child, we're going to make you our slave. So it's literally just rampaging a city and turning everyone in them into your slave, which I think is even worse than buying a slave.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, so I'm not, how would I put this? So I'm not opposed to like warfare involving slavery in and of itself. It would depend how this like here's an example, right? I'll give you an example. If Ukraine captured a bunch of Russian territory, and then the options are you've got all these people and you can either send them back and then they'll be economically productive for Russia, or you can make them work for you. I'm not like opposed to that.
Yeah, here's what I would do, or what I would say is the most moral option is just don't take the territory. Don't go stealing other people's lands and
Right, but
forcing the people in it to do anything.
you
Just leave
understand
them
that
in their homes and leave
warfare,
them alone.
right? So what do you do when you're at war with someone?
I would say play defense, prevent them from attacking you, and try your best to avoid killing any civilians and harmless victims.
Sure, but the uh, what if playing defense means that you lose and that all of your civilians die?
Well, maybe some offense that we could play would involve sending, a few elite soldiers into their territory to assassinate the leader who's responsible for commanding the war in the first place.
You don't think that if that was possible, they would have already done it?
I mean, it's tricky, and I don't know what the best solution is, but I certainly don't think that Deuteronomy 20 gives us any reason to believe these other countries were actually at war with the Israelites. I mean, God just says, this is how you are to treat every nation that is around you. And
That's
so it
fair.
doesn't say this is how you treat people when you're at war with them. It just says, this is how we treat our neighbors. Love your neighbor as yourself. Nah, let's just enslave our neighbors and kill them unwarranted, because God never says you need to be at war with them first. He says this is how you're supposed to treat everybody.
Yeah, I would need to know. This might sound like cope, but it's not. I would need to know more about, like, for example, when people, there's like a passage in the Old Testament that people talk about a lot, where it's like if your kid's being a real asshole, then you just kill him. Now, to be fair,
That sounds like what God would do.
yeah, to be fair, I think it's talking about like if he's a drunkard and he's like constantly causing problems, and presumably he's not like 5 if he's a drunkard. Um, but people bring that up, but then other people say like there's no evidence that this ever happened. Like, there's no evidence that anybody ever thought that this was like a real thing to do versus just like um an explanation for like the fact that children should be under their parents' authority and respectful and not drunk. So when you say things like, here's this command in the Bible, I'd be interested to know if there's any evidence that anyone ever did this.
Well, to me, that's totally irrelevant, because the fact that God commands it and sanctions it is all we need to make the claim that the God of the Bible is immoral. And if the
But you
justification
can't make that
around,
claim.
if the justification for getting around God being immoral is, well, at least people never actually listened to God. So, in that sense, life is better than if we had actually obeyed God. I would say, yes, life is better because we did not obey God. But that certainly doesn't mean that God is a moral agent. That just means that humans know better than he does.
So there are two things. The claim I'm making is not that how great that nobody ever did it. What I'm saying is I'm curious how the people who received the text interpreted it, right? Like, did the people who received the text even think that these commandments were literal? It's possible that they did. I don't know. But it's like, for example, one of the arguments that people make, like for old churches and the Orthodox and the Catholics, is like they received the texts, right? So we should read what they thought about them. I would apply the same kind of standard to some of these texts, where it's like, if you have this text and then you have another text, like if we had a text that said, hey, I received this, by the way, this is what I think about it, that would change my interpretation of it, obviously.
Well,
And
if
then the
we're
second
to,
thing is just you said like these are immoral commandments. To be clear, you mean that they violate your preference, right?
yeah, they violate my preference of avoiding unnecessary harm and suffering to innocent children and women and men. But I think if we're to, accept that the Old Testament is a portrayal of history, it does include how the Israelites, who supposedly were the ones who got this information from God, how they interpreted and responded to it. So if we looked at Numbers 31, for example, we see an instance of God commanding the Israelites to take vengeance on a neighboring tribe, the Midianites, and then the Israelites go out and kill all the men. But then when they get done, Moses is like, hey guys, how come you left alive all these children? You didn't finish the job. You need to go back to Midian, slaughter all the boys, and then take the young virgin girls home as prisoners of war and use them as wives for yourself. So here Moses is encouraging them to slaughter babies, and then after they get done, God is involved with the human trafficking. Here's like, okay guys, you're going to give this many young virgin girls to this city, and then you'll give this many young virgin girls to that city. God is telling them how to distribute human property. He's saying, here's how you move your young virgin girls around to everyone that needs one, so that you can all get a new young wife. And that's how the Israelites were. I mean, that's the impression they got, that these aren't just commands of, oh, God just tells us to run around committing genocide, but he doesn't really mean it. Or if we don't do it, then it's not that big of an issue. But I mean, according to Numbers and Deuteronomy and Exodus, they did complete these horrible acts.
Yeah. So I got to go soon, by the way, because I've got to finish this uni assignment. It's due tonight.
Sure, I understand.
But it's been 2 hours. It's been a good conversation.
Yeah.
So I can't say for sure. There's like another thing I'd have to look more into before I came to a conclusion. I've heard people mention that it is common in like ancient Near Eastern war culture where they'll say things like, we killed all of them, and then they obviously don't, right? I think the Midianites come back later in the Bible, so it can't be true that they actually killed all of them, because if they did, the Midianites wouldn't come back.
Well, I just want to make one tiny correction. So yeah, the Bible never says that they killed all the Midianites and God never commanded them to kill all of them. It says that they did keep the young virgin girls and turn them into wives. But there's other tribes whom God did order the complete genocide of, like the Canaanites, Hivites, Hittites.
Yeah, but again, I'm pretty sure
and then those
a lot of
tribes
these
do
come
pop
back
up again later, to your point.
So it couldn't be the case, at least as you mentioned, like with the Canaanites, for example. I think we know that they definitely come back later in the Bible. So, but in this instance, it's hard to know. Well, like, here's a question for you: if somebody's done something wrong,
I want to hear your question, but first, I just want to respond to that. So,
Yeah.
in that particular case, I would say that the fact that the Israelites failed to carry out God's command does not get God off the hook for making the command in the first place. So God is saying, completely destroy these tribes, leave alive nothing that breathes. That's a direct order to kill children, which we already know God is okay with, because the Israelites slaughtered all the young Midianite boys. So God is very much okay with slaughtering children. So we have no reason to believe he was joking or being hyperbolic when he said this. And we have every reason to think that the Israelites interpret it as leave alive nothing that breathes, completely destroy them. And when you go and rampage a city and start slaughtering people and babies, a couple of them are bound to run away before you can get to everyone, especially if the tribe has thousands or tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands. So the fact that the Israelites failed in carrying out God's command does not mean that God was justified in saying kill babies.
I don't know if that is true.
You don't know if what's true.
I've never heard an argument against the Lord taketh away other than just your appeal to your preference.
Well, if God is all powerful, he can do whatever he wants. I mean, he can, he gives life, he takes life away. I brought you into this world, I'll take you out. But that's just Bill Cosby morality, and if God is actually moral, then he can't just do whatever he wants and it's automatically right. He's bound by protecting the well-being of thinking creatures. And if he doesn't do that,
well, that's what you think morality is.
Right. And God thinks morality is whatever I say goes, and I get to say whatever I want and do whatever I want, and you can't say otherwise. That allows God to get away with literally anything. He can drown babies. He can have women raped as a punishment for things their men did. He can order people to own slaves and command the killing of children. He can get away with all these things if morality is just contingent on whatever his subjective opinion happens to be that day.
So here's a question for you. Does
Sure.
God owe you anything?
Well, assuming, because I want to be charitable in my answer, assuming that God is real, I think he owes me, what he would owe me is just not killing me. I don't think he's justified in causing me unnecessary pain or going out of his way to cause me misery. I think he would be obliged to not do that.
Okay. So maybe this is just my deep-rooted stoicism, but like the idea that like pain is inherently bad is not something I've ever appreciated as like a worldview. My view, again, even when I was an atheist, right, from the Stoic perspective, is just that like pain just is. It's not either good or bad. It's wrong to cause pain to another human because it's contrary to your nature. But if there was some...
What about
Well, I
causing
hope that
pain
makes
as
sense.
contrary to nature? Because we see other animals in nature causing pain to each other. We see
Yeah.
alpha giraffes killing young male giraffes. So like, killing other members of your own species, that's not anything that's unnatural.
Yeah, so this is what's the word? Word concept fallacy. When the Stoics use the word nature, it's a capital N nature, and it's referring to the self-evident nature of human beings to be social. So the Stoics would just say that it's like there's this word teleology, which just means like the study of function. They would say it's like teleologically true, like it's the function of the human to work together, absent what we might have evolved to do, right? Which is like feel anger and pick up a rock and bash someone in the head. But absent that, it's still our function to work together. But I don't, to be honest, I don't find teleological arguments absent God to be very convincing anymore, because
Yeah, I
that
think
they're
that,
just like appeals to intuition. But
to say that we evolved to work together in the sense that working together is what enabled us to, reach our current point in evolution. Humans are
sure.
really not well suited for fighting other animals. We don't have sharp claws. We don't have sharp teeth. We're not super fast. We
I
don't
might
have
disagree
venom.
with that.
You disagree with what?
Well, like if you can make a sharp stick, a human is actually like a very dangerous animal.
Oh, sure. Our intelligence allows us to create tools, but inherently our bodies are not very dangerous. Our mind is our
I just don't
biggest
think you can
advantage
separate
because,
the two, right? Like I think that our intelligence makes us well suited for extreme danger, like being very dangerous to all other species.
yeah, I'm not trying to separate mind and body. I'm not a mind body dualist. I think that they are completely
Yeah,
connected and that our
yeah,
mind
sure.
is a product of evolution. But I guess I'm just trying to say, like, I don't think we can say the function of humans is cooperation any more than we can say the function of humans is reproduction or anything else that we've evolved to do.
Yeah, so this is why I said at the end of my little monologue that I don't believe you can make a strong argument like I used to agree with the Stoic perspective when I was an atheist, but I don't think you can make a strong argument for it without a god. Or a lot of the Stoics were polytheistic, so they would say gods. But because if you have that, then you can say that there's like some divinely commanded nature and like we're made for a particular purpose. But if you don't have it, it seems like it's kind of an appeal to intuition, where you're saying, well, it's so obvious that we're made to work together, but then that's not really obvious.
It seems like that's kind of the same thing theists are doing by saying it's obvious that God made us for this purpose, but how do they know? How does anyone know what God wants? And
Well,
even
yeah,
if God did make us for a specific purpose, would that make that purpose moral? Or would that mean we're obligated to agree with God's goal? Surely there could exist, logically speaking, a God who creates humans or some other creature just for the sake of inflicting pain and suffering. Like if there's a really sadistic God who just wants to create beings just to see them suffer and experience pain, we would probably say that's an immoral God. But if we're just assuming that everything a God says and wants is automatically good, then that means we would have to agree that causing pointless pain just for the fun of it is a good thing.
It's an interesting question. Some people would say that God being good is definitionally true, and so they would just reject your notion. Some people would say God being good in the way we think already is like a necessary feature of God, that like God couldn't be evil. I don't know where I would fall on that, but it's an interesting point.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us back to the whole, is good a truth claim? Is goodness something that can be discovered, or is it exclusively the opinions of people? And
Yeah,
I do think after some more thought, I lean more towards the second one, where morality is just the opinions of
right.
of
Like
men and women.
like emotivism, like Alex O'Connor, or
Yeah, closer to that. And I think that morality hinges on a subjective goal, and once we set it, then we can make objective assessments as to whether actions help us reach that goal faster or not. So if we have the goal of improving morality, then we can say that punching someone in the face is wrong. But if our goal is, I want humans to worship me regardless of their pain and suffering, but I want them to have to choose to worship me, then we could say that commanding people to unalive babies isn't necessarily wrong, given that the only goal of the universe is to have humans choose to worship God, if that's the ultimate purpose of humans.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's very unintuitive. I think that might be a good note to end on, because I probably have to go soon. But
Sure. Yeah, I totally understand. And Alex, I want to thank you a lot for the conversation. This has been interesting.
You too. Yeah, thank you very much.
And I hope that you continue researching, reading, watching videos, and learning as much as you can about theology, and especially diving into some of these moral issues, regarding the Bible, because I think that, to me, that was one of the biggest nails in the coffin, is that if any God who exists can't possibly be the one from the Bible, if God is by definition good, then this God can't be real, because he's so atrocious in every single way.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. I understand why you think that.
Sure, right on. And yeah, I'd be happy to have another conversation someday, maybe more about the historicity of the Bible, or whatever else.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks again for coming, Alex. Thank everyone for watching. I appreciate you guys being here and sending your love. More debates to come in the future, more fun to have, more videos to post. So I look forward to seeing all of you guys soon. And until then, take it easy.
Yeah. Oh man, I just realized